All right. Welcome, everyone. I am really excited today to have Dr. Deborah Thompson here with us. Thank you so much for being here. And for those of you who are not familiar with Dr. Thompson, let me just kind of start by giving you a brief bio on her vast experience. So she's Associate Professor of Political Science at McGill and Canada Research Chair in Racial Inequality in Democratic Societies. She's a leading scholar on the comparative politics of race. With a PhD from the University of Toronto, her research explores race, the state, and inequality in democratic societies, particularly in Canada and the US. Her notable works include The Schematic State and The Long Road Home. I'm going to read a paragraph from her book in a minute. A member of the Royal Society of Canada's College of New Scholars, Artists, and Scientists, Dr. Thompson is widely recognized for her impactful contributions. So welcome, Dr. Thompson.
Thank you. I'm already embarrassed by that. I did all those things and I find it, and it's embarrassing. But
did all those things and more. So let me just start. This is your book, The Long Road Home. Mm-hmm. I just want to read a paragraph that really... anyway, it's really impactful. So let me get going. So it's on page 57. In hindsight, the idea that anyone could believe that racism magically stopped at the 49th parallel is ridiculous, especially given that Canada was founded as a white settler society. A more careful and systematic comparison between Canada and the United States reveals not the absence of racism, but the ways that various formulations and intersections of individualized, structural, and institutional racism simply work differently in ways that are sometimes harder to pinpoint, in covert ways that often stand in stark and sneaky contrast to the explicit history and contemporary manifestations of racism in the United States. Mm-hmm. Wow. So where do we start? Do you want to give us a little bit of maybe context in terms of what I just read, and then we can kind of launch into the backlash against DEI efforts?
Yeah, absolutely. So hi, everyone. My name's Deb Thompson. I'm a professor of political science at McGill, but I spent 10 years before coming to McGill in the US, working at different institutions of higher education, including I was at Harvard for a little bit, I was at Northwestern University for a little bit, I was at the University of Oregon. And as someone who's Canadian and trained here in Canada, spent most of my adult life in Canada studying the politics of race. I remember before going to the US, I was really interested in in putting my money where my mouth was. You know, I'd been arguing for years that racism in Canada exists and it's just as harmful, just as entrenched as it is in the US. And then I moved to the US to see if that was in fact the case. And I found that I was both right and wrong. And the kind of the thrust of my work these days is that racism, discrimination, various patterns of structural inequality, they're present in both societies, but they manifest in different ways. And because we in Canada, we're always looking for the ways that racism manifests in the US as evidence, as like the smoking gun that it exists here. But of course, we have a different political system, we have a different political culture, and so the way that racism and sexism and homophobia and all the other isms operate in Canada is, of course, it's going to be different because it's nuanced to respond to the particular domestic, political, cultural, social environment.
Interesting. Maybe you can just give us, because I know your background. We've talked about, it at length, but maybe you can just, share a little bit about your upbringing, because you grew up in Ontario, right?
I grew up in Oshawa, Ontario, just outside Toronto. Yeah. I mean, I'm from Canada. My experience, so I am in my 40s. I just rolled my eyes, but I am happily in my 40s. Lots of folks don't get to make it to this stage. So I'm in my 40s. And so I grew up in Oshawa, Ontario, in the 1980s. Like I was young in the 1980s. I was my children's age in the 1980s. And so when folks talk to me about Canadian multiculturalism and Canadian diversity, my response to them is always to just temper some of that enthusiasm with the kind of the demographic reality of Canadian multiculturalism. So the policy dates back to like 1971. We call ourselves a diverse society, and we are, absolutely. But Canada didn't start getting really diverse until the 90s, until the mid 90s, in fact. And so a lot of our human rights legislation, a lot of the charter, the multiculturalism policy, these were all policies that were put in place both by and for a majority white country. And by majority white, I mean, if you look at the 1981 census, Canada is like 97% white.
Wow.
It's really, really, like my dad used to joke. My dad grew up in Toronto in the 1950s. And he used to joke that if you saw another Black person in Toronto, you were related to them because there were so few. There were so few people. And he's right. Up until we changed our white-only immigration policy in 1967, there were like 30,000 Black people in the country, right? Tiny, tiny numbers. And so when we talk about multiculturalism, I just want to I say that to emphasize that our multicultural rhetoric, our multicultural symbolism,
Right.
for a really long time, it was just that. It was symbols, and symbols are important. But at the same time, when we're looking at like the demographic realities of the country, we need to base some of those assessments in like empirics, in facts and evidence.
Got it. By the way, for those of you who are listening in, if this is the first time, don't hesitate to put your comments or questions that you have in the chat. And at about 1:45, the top of the hour, we'll get to those questions. Okay.
Yeah.
So there's been considerable backlash against DEI efforts in recent years, but in the past 6 months, it's been insane, really.
In the past week. Yeah.
So where do you think this backlash originates? And how does it impact organizations and society at large? And let me just we'll load up the questions as we go along.
Yeah. So I have two answers to that. On the one hand, there is a historic pattern of progress, progress towards racial justice, and then a disproportionate backlash. Right. And this is true from the early days, right? Like from like the 18th century. So we see the first Black codes in the US, which prohibit enslaved people from learning to like read and write. We see those in response to coalitions that were being built among enslaved Africans and free Blacks and poor white people to potentially like overthrow the colonial elite. Right. At the same time, the American Civil War, we see the backlash, right? After Reconstruction, there was redemption, right? The return of white supremacy. After the Civil Rights Movement, we see President Nixon's Law and Order and President Reagan's introduction of neoliberalism and, Brian Mulroney's like version of that here in Canada, and the massive retrenchment of the welfare state. And what that means is that in the 1990s, we see this withdrawal of government funding from the social programs which we need and hold dear, not just welfare. The welfare state refers to education, healthcare, social benefits, all of it. And so this most recent backlash fits that pattern, right? In Black Lives Matter originates in 2012. It has like its first kind of phase in 2015. And then we see George Floyd, of course, in 2020, and Me Too as well, right? In 2015, 2016, 2017, the Me Too movement. So these represent kind of like these progressive pushes towards a different kind of social contract, a different kind of society. And now we're in this pattern of backlash, right? So we can trace the most recent backlash is really against those movements. And so in some ways, this is very familiar. If you've studied history long enough, like Mark Twain once said, history doesn't repeat itself, but it often rhymes. And so we're in this moment and we've been here before. And if you are lucky enough to live long enough, the pendulum will swing back the other way. It'll take maybe 5, maybe 10 years, but we will see the pendulum swing again, because this is the pattern of our societies. So what we're seeing is a massive backlash against DEI. But like the way in which this is different is, I think the administration in the United States right now is like, they're not even being sneaky about it,
right.
Really, even when Nixon was in power, law and order was a code, and states' rights were codes for reversing the gains of the civil rights movement. And now we actually just have blatant, federal DEI programs have been terminated. Those people have been put on leave, will probably be fired.
Yep.
We see in, I think just yesterday or the day before, President Trump announced that he would use the powers of the Department of Justice to investigate corporations that have DEI programs. There's going to be a rollback in universities. What we've seen happen in Florida will probably be happening on the federal, on the national level. And so in some ways, this is very, very different, in part because it is so explicit and so unabashed. And in Canada, obviously, this is a concern for multinational corporations, like corporations that deal with businesses in the US. But really, it's a concern here too, because the backlash is already here. And it's already real. It's already affecting businesses, how they operate. We see a rollback. We see at least the threat of a rollback. The University of Alberta recently announced it was changing some of its language around EDI to, I don't know, human rights or something that's less triggering for those folks who find it.
A lot of organizations have cut DEI departments completely, right?
Yeah.
First they cut budget, and then they cut the roles. And then what we've seen also with Walmart and Costco, two different, right? Costco has dug in, Walmart has, which is surprising, I think, for a lot of people. Does it surprise you?
It doesn't. I mean, it doesn't surprise me. It doesn't surprise me in part because, look, businesses, their bottom line is profits. That's absolutely understandable in a capitalist society. I don't begrudge anyone for that. That makes sense. And there was a time when DEI was really profitable. Exactly. It was an op-ed in the New York Times by, I'm gonna mess up his name, Ross Dolphin, whatever, called it woke capitalism, and it was really profitable for companies to jump on board, given that cultural shift. And now, given that the culture is shifting back, it's not super surprising that corporations are rethinking those policies. The challenge here is that, and the argument I would put to people who are listening is that DEI is actually just meeting our basic requirements to human rights legislation.
Right.
DEI isn't voluntary. It's not a fad. It is adhering to basic human rights, which are in fact constitutionalized in this country under the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, and certainly legislated in provincial human rights codes.
Oh, that's an excellent point. In your opinion, what are some of the most common misconceptions about DEI, and how can organizations better understand what DEI really entails versus what it doesn't?
Yeah, there's a lot of talk about DEI. I'm actually in the process of writing a longish op-ed that will appear in the Globe and Mail probably next Saturday. I'm not entirely sure when it's coming out, about the backlash to DEI and the common misconceptions. And I think so the arguments against DEI are largely what we in the academy call straw men, which means they're arguments that are not backed up by evidence, right? And so the arguments are things like, identity politics are divisive. They only work to divide people. DEI gives unearned, undeserved preference to people from diverse backgrounds, while negating excellence or intelligence or ingenuity. We see arguments that a colorblind approaches end up being more egalitarian, that DEI uses a mentality of punishing largely white straight men for their identities. That, oh gosh, I think that the argument around merit is really the trickiest one.
Right.
And that's the one that I confront, I think, the most in my work. And the argument is, against DEI is that it's giving preference to people who don't deserve it, right?
Mhm.
So it's preference, and it's about candidates that don't deserve it, right? And this is it's such a toxic, it's such a really a toxic way of thinking, because that's not how DEI works. And it's not how it has ever worked. Just so we are clear, there is no affirmative action in Canada, right? Like, we do not give hiring preferences. That is not the way our policy, which is called employment equity, actually works. In fact, our policy of employment equity, first of all, it only pertains to the federal workforce and contractors that work with the federal government. So we're talking about 10% of the Canadian labor force, tiny percentages. Second of all, it doesn't give preference. What it does is require those organizations to be held accountable for the demographic of their workforce, like to set goals and try to create ways to attain those equity goals. But the accountability mechanisms in the Employment Equity Act have not been effective. The last time an organization was audited and found liable, for missing its employment equity targets was 1995, and the fine was $3,000. That was the last time, right? And so there's all this misconception about like DEI in this country. It doesn't work the way we think it does. I think we hear what's happening in the US and we assume that the political levers are the same here, and they simply are not.
You and I had touched on it in our last conversation, but I find it ironic that there is a lawsuit that federal employees, right, they've taken the government to court essentially around discriminatory, not so much recruitment practices, it's actually discrimination against them being able to move up within their roles.
Yeah.
So it's ironic that we have a government that seems so pro diversity, pro immigration, and then on the other hand, they've been systematically, discriminated against for years. So not getting the increases, not getting opportunities to advance in their careers, which has been limiting for I don't know how many federal workers, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it reminds me of this thing I caught on Twitter back when I was on Twitter. And it was something like, the history we have been taught cannot possibly have produced the contemporary circumstances that we are now in, right? And I think the same thing about employment equity, about DEI, like the backlash against DEI, is so misplaced, right? Because if DEI did all of the things that the critics claim that it does, we would have a very different workforce.
Right.
We really would. We'd have way more women in positions of power. We'd have more racialized folks. We've had people with disabilities, Indigenous folks. We'd have different looking, like corporate boards. We'd have different looking C-suites, right? And so this is what I mean. Like the backlash is mostly rhetorical, because the employment equity policy, for example, hasn't even worked in the federal government. It hasn't even worked there. It's worked actually quite well for white women. That's kind of the only group that
Yeah.
these policies have ended up benefiting. But for all other categories, and especially for Black and Indigenous people, we've seen no movement in 30 years.
Wow. Okay, here's another question for you. How would you differentiate between an organization's human rights obligations and their DEI initiatives, right? So are those concepts complementary or separate? This is in line with what you were just talking about.
Yeah, I think so. So our human rights obligations as employers, and organizations are legislatively required
Right.
to ensure our workplaces are free from discrimination and harassment, right? And so a lot of, I think, what we consider to be DEI are actually just good human resource policies, right? To ensure that there's transparency, accountability, that there are ways to file grievances or complaints that then have like some kind of accountability attached, some kind of process where the person doing, the accounting isn't also the person who has potentially perpetuated the harm, right?
Right.
You see a lot of those kind of circular situations. And so, a lot of what people think of as DEI is actually just meeting those very, very basic, very minimal human rights legislated objectives. Now, some organizations do go above and beyond, right? And so this is where we get into initiatives that are like employee resource groups, mentoring, and that's important. It's really important because what I think organizations are trying to do is to address, like, very, very carefully the various obstacles to full participation in the workforce, in the economic life of this country, which are still really, really prominent, right? Like, people are much more likely to look to their networks. We're doing this for LinkedIn, which is, of course, a networking tool.
Right.
People are more likely to look to their networks to find colleagues, to find future colleagues, to find people to mentor, right? To find people to support in various ways. And that's fine, except, the data demonstrate really clearly that our networks are segregated. Our friend networks are segregated. Chris Rock has this great bit from years and years ago where he said, America's so multicultural. All of my Black friends have tons of white friends, and all of my white friends have one Black friend. But it's a joke, but that's actually like the network analysis of places like Facebook and Instagram and whatever, show that our social networks are in fact full of people who look like us.
Right.
And that's who you're going to for these opportunities. You're going to get a talent pool that is not diverse, but that doesn't include women, or that is able to prop up like the token one at the expense for like the many, many, many other people who could be qualified.
It's interesting because when I think about, how the government has, I don't want to say managed immigration, but
yeah, no, it has
been. I read an article recently, actually, that was talking about how that's actually going to be our superpower when dealing with the U.S. potentially. When we talk about tariffs and trade war and that kind of thing, and the fact that we've had this influx of new arrivals over the last few years, and we can leverage their languages, their understanding of the countries that they've left to come to Canada and be able to use it to develop new trade partnerships and deeper relationships with other countries, right? And reading this article, I was thinking about our conversation today and how this is just one example of the richness that it brings when you're bringing people into the country, who can add value in a multitude of ways. Sometimes it's in ways that we're not even thinking about at the time, right?
Yeah, and this is really important because some of the rhetoric around, there is a lot of anti-immigrant sentiment in Canada right now. The public opinion on immigration has shifted really, really quickly. Almost in a heartbeat. It's wild if you study public opinion and look at how drastically things have changed in a short time. But again, like the rhetoric here is coming, a lot of it's coming from the US, which has a different immigration system, right? So in Canada, our immigration system prioritizes workers, right? Economic migrants. And in fact, the class of migrant that is admitted like through these economic programs is like double the size of all other admission classes combined.
Wow.
So if you look at like immigrants who are here because of family reunification, asylum seekers, like refugees, those numbers are tiny, 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 tiny compared to economic migrants, which are like, again, the vast majority of folks who are admitted to Canada. In the US, it's not that way. It's not that way. And the last time Trump was president, part of his proposal to change the American immigration system is actually to align it more to what Canada's already doing. So a lot of, again, this like anti-immigrant sentiment that like, undocumented folks are coming here and stealing our jobs, whatever. Canada, we do, of course, have undocumented folks in Canada. The numbers aren't even comparable to what's happening in the US. So again, it's so ironic that like this backlash rhetoric can be so readily accepted here in Canada. And yet the idea that racism exists here, is so hard to accept.
That's fascinating. We're starting to get some comments in the chat. So how much time do we have? About 15 more minutes. So what are the common pitfalls organizations face when trying to implement DEI initiatives, and how can they avoid them? Do you have any suggestions?
So many. So I think that some of the backlash that we've seen against DEI is that these initiatives just aren't effective. They don't work. They end up ostracizing. They preach to the converted. They ostracize people. They create a culture of toxicity. All of those arguments. And like nuance is actually really important here. So there's a sociologist at Harvard. His name's Frank Dobbin, and he has done a ton of work with a lot of data on DEI policies and what works and what doesn't. And so, for example, trainings can backfire. Absolutely. Trainings where you mandate like your entire organization to attend a training, and perhaps you've hired a consultant who doesn't know the research. Those can absolutely like backfire. There's actually really interesting studies coming out of the University of Northern Arizona, I think, that demonstrate that trainings around consent actually backfire for white men. It makes them less likely to seek consent in sexual encounters. I know, like that runs counter to like everything we think about trainings.
Right.
And so I think one of the major mistakes that organizations make is just like picking initiatives without knowing what the organization needs. And so, if I were talking to an organization, and I do consult with organizations pretty regularly, what I would start with is data. If you don't know what who is in your workforce, if you don't know who your clients are, like what kind of demographics we're talking about, you can't make good policies. You can't create good practices. Time and time again, the one initiative that we do find, or Dobbin's research demonstrates, is successful across various organizations is employee resource groups.
Yeah.
And that makes sense. Because there's so much about existing in an organization that is simply about informal rules, informal networks. And you don't, as somebody who, I grew up poor, I obviously am racialized, I'm a woman. And for a lot of those kind of informalities, I didn't realize they were norms until I stumbled over them, I really did. I didn't have, my parents were, my dad was a teacher and my mom was a stay-at-home mom. Like I didn't know what corporate or middle class white collar life was like. You
Right.
know, I didn't know what to do. And so employee resource groups are really helpful in enabling folks from different backgrounds to navigate really tricky, like workplace social situations through informal mentoring. Like that tends to work really well across organizations. But for other initiatives, you need to start with data. You need to start with like a deep knowledge about what your challenge is. Because if your challenge is hiring compared to a challenge of retention, compared to a challenge of moving folks up the ladder, like those require different solutions.
Right. I mean, I would argue that most organizations, I don't believe, have been very good at collecting any data while they quickly tried to build, DEI department or team. We saw a lot of those roles being gifted to employees who might otherwise lose their job because of some cuts, or it was a way for organizations to attract talent during the talent shortage. So it was almost like I don't know, like an advertising gimmick in a way. Well, I think of it that way now, certainly because those DEI teams have been dismantled in a lot of organizations, right? So I find it, I'd be surprised if there's, I mean, I don't know, I could be wrong, but I'd be really surprised to see that organizations are doing even a half decent job of collecting data.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, even I have a grant that I'm working on with Fan Liu, who's a political scientist at Queen's, and Aaron Tully, who's a political scientist at Carleton. And what we are doing is looking at the ways in which people identify by race.
Right.
Because believe it or not, that kind of research hasn't actually been done. And so we have a couple of quantitative experiments where, you know, we give people options to choose how they would best identify themselves. And then we see like how that affects other things around political behavior. But some of our data, you know, really interestingly point to like the way those categories on survey forms frequently don't speak to how people see themselves. So the category
Right.
visible minority, nobody likes that language. It's being revised in the federal government. But visible minority, like Indigenous folks definitely have never seen themselves as visible minorities. They've never been categorized as visible minorities.
Right.
Black people don't see themselves as visible minorities. And some of the other categories, which are like standard, just like don't resonate with people. So think about the category like Arab. Like that, you know, that person could be from anywhere, you know, really, it's a wild catch-all category.
Or if you're mixed, right?
Or
Maybe
if you're
half
mixed.
Arab, half, right?
Exactly. And this is part of like the category Latin American, or like the Latinx or Hispanic population in the US is like a great example of this, where like, you know, that's about like a language and a region, you know, and not necessarily about like being a visible racialized minority. And so this is again where like you have to craft like the way that you collect these data really, really, really carefully. And, you know, I've had, you know, years ago, I had an organization contact me really last minute, and they said, you know, we're about to send out this survey to our workforce. Can you look at it? And it was just like nonsensical, you know, like there was, I think like Francophone was under the race question. And I was like, oh, this is like, this is, and you could only check one box, you know, so you could be like Black or Francophone, but not both, you know? And I said to them, like, you're not going to be able to use this data. Like these data are going to be useless to you in creating any kind of initiative that will work. And the person was like, well, it's going out tomorrow, you know? And so, like, this is a thing, is the way in which you collect these data really, really matter. And we have to have evidence-based policies, otherwise they won't work. And so it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. You know, folks say DEI initiatives are ineffective, but they weren't created well in the first place.
Yeah.
You know, they weren't created well in the first place. Being purposeful, being strategic, being deliberate about these policies are absolutely necessary.
You know, it's interesting because a number of years ago, I went to a LinkedIn conference in Texas and got to hear from the director of talent acquisition at the time for the FBI. And he was talking about how he was mandated to essentially increase visibility of different groups within the FBI. And it was a lot of selling the program and, you know, talking to different leaders. And what he realized was that there's a lot of information that gets transmitted between, like, among, let's just say, like, white professionals, right? So
Mhm.
a certain language and just helpful tips and hints when you're leveraging kind of networks and being comfortable being raised in an environment maybe through your family where it's not a big deal to just leverage, you know, your parents' network or to ask questions. But not everybody was getting the same information. So if you're, you know, if you've been plugged into somebody in the FBI and they're telling you how to handle, you know, certain questions or what you can expect or the steps and the stages versus people who never even knew anybody who had ever worked at the FBI, right? So
Yeah.
kind of more racialized groups. So for him, it was making the playing field very even. And there
Mhm.
was a lot of backlash against that, saying, why? Why do we have to put this on our website in terms of what they can expect and what questions they, and he's like, but it's not equal. So you think that the best people are getting the jobs, but in fact, it's the people who've been primed for the job who's getting the job.
Yeah, who have been socialized their whole lives. You know, I had a student I was working with when I was at the University of Oregon who really ended up running on the wrong side of the school's disciplinary system. And it was nothing that he did. He just, you know, it's a long story. But when the university essentially kicked him out of his dorm. And I said to him, like, when you got this letter, you know, it was so wrong. Like, why didn't you push back? And he was like, well, it was a rule. You know, they told me a rule. And I thought, man, this is like the kid of immigrants, right? And we are taught to obey the rules. You know, my
Yeah.
parents are immigrants, but like, this is it, right? This is what immigration does to you. This is an experience of immigration is in fact to abide by the rules and to be very careful because your status is dependent on it. And so when this poor kid didn't run afoul of the rules, but people used that language, like weaponized that language against him, he was like, well, you know, well, why, like, I can't push back, you know, this is an official thing, this, you know,
Right.
where, and I even see this in my classroom of like the students who are most likely to challenge their grades.
Mm.
Not women, let me tell you, they're not women and they're not racialized people, but like the white dudes in my class will absolutely fight about their grades, or will ask for extensions, you know, even that. And so having, for example, to bring this back to organizational policies, having in my syllabus, this is how you go about asking for extensions is
Mm.
important because it does level the playing field, because it, for those folks who maybe are first generation university students, it clues them in that, oh, like, if, you know, if I need an extension, I can just ask for one. They would never otherwise think about that as a possibility.
Right. Wow. Okay, we have time for maybe two more questions, and then I'm going to go and look at the comments. Okay, so we talked a little bit about intersectionality. You touched on it a little bit, but how does that concept influence the way we should approach DEI in the workplace?
Yeah, I think that intersectionality gets a bad rap because I think folks don't understand what it means. So intersectionality, I think people think it means like Black women, right? Yeah.
Okay.
No, like I think people think like intersectionality means like some people have intersectional identities and some people don't, but that's really
Mm.
not what it is, right? Intersectionality is a theory that came out of American legal studies by Kimberly Crenshaw is often credited with it. And what it means is that there are different structures of domination and oppression that intersect to produce different positions,
Okay.
right? relative positions of power and privilege. And so like what that means is that, intersectionality actually helps us understand how Trump won this most recent American election, right? Because it is totally understandable that somebody who grew up white and poor in rural America would be concerned about their economic livelihood, right? And could potentially still benefit from white privilege, even as they're disadvantaged in all kinds of other ways, right? And just as I, as someone who is like a racialized woman, but I also have a host of privileges, including class privileges, including that I speak English without an accent. My French is terrible. That's a problem here in Quebec. And I have light skin privilege. And so intersectionality is really about nuancing the way in which our identities position us relative to other people. And that can be challenging to integrate into policy or into like organizational practices. But like an emphasis on intersectionality does help us understand why, for example, Black populations are less likely to disclose like mental health disabilities.
Okay.
In part because coming out of the Black community, we would never say something like, like my great aunt had mental health challenges. We would say like, she's a little funny, Aunt D's a little funny, but there are huge stigmas against like disabilities in certain communities, right? Mm-hmm. There's a challenge of folks who not only like folks who have English as a first language compared to like a second or third or fourth language are going to react to situations differently, right? And so the idea of intersectionality here is just an understanding that when we're creating DEI policies, nobody is like just their race or just their gender or just their ability or just their socioeconomic status. It's always a mix, it's always an intersectional position. And so when, for example, trying to craft these policies so they reach populations that really need that leg up, or really need the playing field to be level, like that's just like what to be aware of.
Okay.
So just so we're not replicating these kinds of privileges, right? And so like a great example is like law school or admission to law school or navigating the legal field as a prospective employers. Like there are lots of racialized like law students who have lawyers who are who have parents who are lawyers, right? And so they know how to navigate that system. And there might be, there are like white students who come from working class backgrounds who don't know how to navigate that system.
Right.
And so leveling the playing field for everybody, right, helps get at those people who are disadvantaged, who we don't even recognize their disadvantage, hidden disadvantages, if that makes sense.
You're making me think of information that was provided maybe 2 or 3 years ago. It was in a panel discussion, and the gentleman who had been crunching these numbers for a nonprofit came forth and said that in Quebec, the more highly educated Black men are, the greater the pay discrepancy with white peers.
Yeah.
So, I mean, if we're starting with minimum wage, you can't go below minimum wage. And let's say you only have high school, and then, you go up to college and university, and then postgraduate studies, the wider the gap, right? And apparently it's even wider if they're Anglophone Black males. In Quebec, we're talking about in Quebec. So it's anyway, I found that it's not surprising, but it was interesting to kind of see the data behind that.
Yeah, and that's why having like this nuance, like in data collection world, we call this like disaggregated data. Like having disaggregated data is really important because some of the lessons that we take as being standard across all groups just like aren't, right? So one of the things is like we assume that second generation, so not immigrants, but folks who are born in the country, tend to do better, to have better socioeconomic outcomes than their parents. Like that's a logic that we have. Like immigrants come here, maybe they have to drive taxis or whatever. They enter into that entrance status of the labor market, but their children do better because their children have higher education levels, etc. And like that general lesson doesn't hold true for all racial groups, right? It doesn't hold true for Black groups. It doesn't hold true for some Latin American groups, for some Filipino groups, right? But it does hold true for like Chinese immigrants and Japanese immigrants and some South Asian immigrants. And so this is why having like nuanced data is actually important, and why have these big catch-all categories like racialized and visible minority just like don't necessarily work, and they hide more than they reveal.
Well, and what we see a lot of too, I mean, I think that there's a lot of immigrants who come here who are very highly educated.
Oh yeah.
And that have their master's or PhD, and yet they're grossly underemployed.
Mm-hmm.
So, from what I've seen is, there's this, that whole, Canadian lack of Canadian experience, and how important it is, when it's important in some cases in terms of understanding regulations and laws, but in other cases, it really just serves to keep people down and underemployed, when they could be doing the job of their boss's boss, right?
Yeah. And that's exactly it. So if I were advising an organization about their DEI policies and practices, I think, like, again, data to me is really an important first step, getting good data. And the second is like conducting a very careful audit of the policies and practices and informalities, that the organization relies on to hire, to retain, to promote, right? From within, like all aspects of the workplace environment, like what is currently on the books, and in what ways are the policies that you currently have potentially biased or are affecting different populations differently. This is like at the core of systemic racism, right? Is universal rules that look fair, they look equal, but really they end up affecting different populations differently. And so you get different outcomes.
Oh my gosh. Okay.
No, time flies. Time flies when you're talking.
Yeah. So we've got actually, there's a question here. So Michael asks, so thank you both for this timely and informative talk, Dr. Thompson. You've provided easy to understand evidence, indeed, about what is really happening in this space, showing how much of the opposition to DEI is rooted in strawman arguments. What strategies have you used to reach and engage with those who oppose DEI?
Ooh, that's a really good question. Yeah. That's a great question, because I think that some, if not a lot of the backlash is really the sense that that people are being attacked, right? That that you can't say or do anything anymore, that you're running, that you have to be careful, or else the woke police will come and yell at you. And there's different strategies for this. Like, I know there are folks out there in DEI spheres who don't have a lot of patience for that argument. I do, like, I have a lot of patience for people who want to do better and maybe who don't know how. I have a lot of patience for people who make mistakes and are willing to learn, because like, the way I think about this is like, I had to learn all of this. I never took a class about race in any of my 3 degrees. I never, I think I had one professor of color in 10 years of post-secondary education. And so I have a lot of patience for people who are just like starting out and want to do better and want to learn. And so I think that it does organizations well to make like information available, to try, in DEI terms, you call people in rather than calling people out, right? There are bad actors out there. I don't want to say there aren't. Like, there are just like good old fashioned like racists out there. Like, I think it's, I met one last week, So it's absurd to think that there aren't those people,
Yeah.
but I think most people do like have good intentions and kind of like just don't know how to go about it. And I think ostracizing people who don't agree with us is not a very good way forward, you know. I think kind of appealing to people's better natures is really the best way to bring people on board to what I think is just like a really important, you know, in organizational terms, economic goal, a business goal, but also just like moral imperative for creating a society that we all want to live in. Oh, so in terms of like strategies, I have endless, like I have endless patience for folks who want to learn, and this is in part because I am a teacher and I teach at McGill. Like most of my students are white, for real. Most of my students are white, and most of my students come in my classroom never having thought of any of this before. And I got I have a ton of patience for people who ask like good, you know, good intentioned questions. You know, I've got a lot of patience for people who want to challenge me. I don't have a lot of patience for folks who play the devil's advocate just to be dicks, like to be frank. Like I don't have a lot of patience for those
Right.
just to play the devil's advocate. I don't have a lot of patience for that, but I do have a lot of patience for like good natured challenging. And it's up to us. If you are pro DEI, it's up to you to have like the evidence to back up what you say.
Yeah.
You know?
I think that DEI is still so new in terms of a career, let's just say, or department within organizations, that I think that there were a lot of people who felt like they had to figure it out on their own. And so, you know, going back to the beginning of our conversation, rely heavily on data, and you recommend to use data to influence. I mean, that's something that all organizations can get behind in terms of a strategy. It's like, let's look at the numbers, right? Is our employee group even reflective, or our board or our management team, is it reflective of the communities that we're serving, of our customers, of, right? There's somebody, that once told me, if you were in, let's say, Montreal, if you were a business in Montreal, which has a lot of great diversity, people coming from, you know, every country around the world, and you don't have a reflection of that diversity in your company, it's because it's been a choice that you've made, right? So Yvonne, shout out to you, because you're the one who said that, and it stuck with me years later. And it's true. I think it's absolutely true. Right.
Yeah. And just so we're clear, you know, there is a very clear business case for having good DEI practices. You know, corporations, organizations, businesses that have inclusive, you know, workplaces that employ DEI policies and do them well, do better on every metric, right? They do, and they're able to reach better talent, both in national and international terms, to reach new markets, right? Like if innovation truly is a buzzword of certain sectors, like you can't get new ideas by having the same people around the table. That's not where new ideas come from.
Exactly. So Nicole Piggott is listening in. Hey, Nicole.
Nicole should be here. She's like
here too. We'll get you guys on another panel. So Nicole's question is, what do you see as the path forward to rally this community?
Yeah, I think, man, that's such a good question, because I think people are tired. And I wrote an article in the Globe a few weeks ago, or I think it was after Trump was elected, and the title was something like, "Where's the resistance?" And the resistance is tired. You know, the resistance is burnt out. And it's going to be a really long 4 years. You know, every day, you know, since, oh my God, January 20th was on Monday. Like, I wake up, I check like the New York Times and the Globe and Mail, and I'm just like, what has happened? What happened? You know, there's so much stuff is happening. And so I think there have to be like good community efforts, you know, to quote unquote resist, right? I think that calling on our networks for both like comfort and calm and coordination is going to be really, really important. I think, I mean, like Nicole is really the expert on all of this. I think it's going to be important in the face of this, current Trump administration to find ways to leverage the legal system that still has not, the whether or not what I mean is like whether or not courts are still an adequate check on legislative power is, I think, an open question. Look at like the composition of the U.S. Supreme Court and be very concerned about whether or not they would be willing to stand up to some blatantly unconstitutional initiatives like the attack on birthright citizenship that has just been announced.
Yeah.
But I think, using the legal system, appealing to some of the policies that we currently have on the book. We have provincial human rights policies. We have provincial human rights commissions. We have the charter, which, section 15.1 prohibits discrimination by state actors. Section 15.2 prevents or like absolves employment equity policies that are aimed at rectifying historical disadvantages from being identified as discriminatory, right? So we have tools at our disposal to mobilize, to use. And I think that, if I could say a plea for any Canadians listening, vote. If you're in Ontario, I think an election might be called next week. I last heard,
yeah.
Right. The federal election is coming up. Vote. Absolutely. Because the decisions that people in power make are highly consequential.
I think what's truly terrifying in all this too is what we're seeing coming out of, leaders. I'm happy to see on LinkedIn that they've been calling out the Nazi salute that, happened twice. In my opinion, I think the whole thing, it's terrifying that this is it's in your face. There's not, I don't know. It seems like not only are we going backwards here, but it just really doesn't feel safe at all.
Yeah.
And when it's leaders of corporations that are kind of backpedaling on some things and then even kind of showing their colors in a way that we haven't seen before, right? So
I mean, I think that I think that if there is hope, it is in social mobilization. I don't mean protests on the street necessarily. I mean the interests of lots of folks from lots of different backgrounds, races, genders, abilities, whatever, are actually much more aligned than we think, right? Or much more aligned perhaps than the current political moment would suggest. And I think that is incredibly powerful. I think that finding those like-minded folks and banding together and trying and really vowing to protect people who are more vulnerable than us, because there are lots of folks who are going to be on the wrong side of the Trump administration and whose lives, livelihoods, families, communities are really under siege right now. And if you are lucky enough to have power and privilege, I think that there's a moral imperative to use that, in the pursuit of justice.
Absolutely agree. Thank you for sharing that. One more question from Miriam. What DEI training resources would you recommend for employers?
Oh, that's really a great question. So let me shout out to Nicole Piggott, who is the CEO and co-founder of Synclusive, which is a company that helps workplaces be better and more strategic about their diversity, not just initiatives, but their diversity, their orientations around these issues. So shout out to Nicole and Synclusive. There's also a ton of research. I have been talking with folks at the Diversity Institute, which is out of TMU, Toronto Metropolitan University. They have a ton of resources on their websites and a team of over 100 people. They specialize specifically in Canadian corporations, Canadian businesses, and they do a lot of surveys that are really useful and also have expertise. So I would look to them. Other things, I don't know, I can send people my syllabus if you're interested in it. But the truth of the matter is, like, Sam, I think that you were right when you said, like, diversity is kind of new. And after 2020, we see, like, all these, I don't know, online MBA programs for certificate in diversity management. And, like, I don't know where those folks are getting trained. But there are good resources out there. Frank Dobbin's work I mentioned before is really useful. He's at Harvard. Anyway, so there are resources out there. I'd start with Nicole Bigot, and I would also check out the Diversity Institute's work and the Canadian Centre for Race Relations as well. There are organizations doing the work.
Amazing. Thank you so much. And again, I'm going to shamelessly plug your book, right? The Long Road Home. If you haven't read it, if you haven't read it, you can order that. And you have an article coming out you said in the Globe and Mail?
Yeah, the Globe and Mail. I don't exactly, it'll be a Saturday article because it's quite long. I need to cut it.
So we'll hopefully you'll post the link to that on LinkedIn, and we'll share that. And Dr. Deborah Thompson, thank you so much for your time today. It's been amazing. You are such a great speaker, and your ability to kind of bring things down to a really, easy to comprehend level is just fantastic. And I value your time here. So thank you. And thank you to everybody who listened in. I really hope that you got something, really meaningful out of this conversation. So have a great day. Enjoy your weekend. And thanks again.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks. Okay.